welcome back. I'm Heather. This is Recently Seen Reading, and I thought I'd chat a little bit about what I read last week. I've had a couple of duds, a couple of okay books, a couple of things that I think are quite great and would bear rereading and would highly recommend. So in terms of duds, they're going to go nameless. One was a romance that just fell apart in the last 30 or 40 pages. Just fell apart. Writer wasn't able to resolve the plot that drew the main characters together. The other was a mystery novel, kind of the 8th in a series of 12 or 14, and I haven't read them all, and it was astonishing. I've never seen a novelist jam so many regional cliches into 40 or 50 pages, and I should have dropped it at the 40 or 50 page mark, but I soldiered on and I regret it. Just appalling. It's like a tourist brochure jammed into a very clumsily managed mystery novel. But on a happier note, my book reading is going really well. I finished Rushdie's Quixote, which I enjoyed. Thought it was good. Thought it was better than Atwood's Testaments by a long shot. I haven't read Rushdie in many years, so it was fun to go back and reread Rushdie, and he's very much the same kind of writer as I remember from the time of Midnight's Children, so that was a lot of fun, and I like Quixote retellings, so I enjoyed that, and I would recommend it if you have the patience for a longer novel that kind of drifts a little bit towards the end, and if you have patience for mirroring narratives that aren't really verisimilitude driven. So I thought that was good. I've also finished Kevin Barry's, what was it called? Nightboat to Tangier, a story of two men in their 50s, aging drug traffickers looking for one of their daughters. And I thought this was good. Reminded me quite a bit of some of the work by Joel Thomas Hines, who's a Newfoundland writer, tackling male lives ruined by addiction in the drug trade. Lots of violence, lots of unhappiness. So I enjoyed Barry's novel, and it made me curious to read something else by him, so that's a positive outcome for reading for me. Then I read a graphic novel, which I thought was fabulous, Hot Cone by Ebony Flowers. So this is a collection of short stories told using comic conventions, and all of the stories include some aspect of dealing with Black women's hair and what that means personally in family structures, socially and culturally. But the hair is really just one aspect of the stories. It's really stories about complex women's lives. And as I was reading it and looking at the drawings and looking at the perspectives of the characters and the way that not quite adult female perspectives are used to tell stories that the narrators don't necessarily understand, I was thinking, this is great. This is so much like Linda Barry, who's a cartoonist whose work I've loved for years. So then I get to the acknowledgements page, and lo, there's Linda Barry's name. I always read the acknowledgement pages because you learn a lot about, if you're lucky, about the writer and the book and its genesis, if it's a well-constructed and nuanced acknowledgement page. So I would highly recommend Hot Comb. It's a drawn quarterly publication and should be easily available either from a bookstore or your library. It's gotten a fair amount of positive press. So that was great. And then I wound up the week with two novels, one for the Gone with a Book Challenge, or read along. So I finished Rose Macaulay's The World My Wilderness. So this is Macaulay's second to last novel, published in 1950, I believe. It tells the story of Barbary, who's a 17-year-old woman moving in 1947 from the south of France, where she's been living with her mother, Helen, back to London to stay with her father, whose name is Gulliver or Gully. And it's a story about how do you construct a life when the previous physical structure of your life, emotional and familiar structure of your life is in ruins. So Barbary fought in the resistance, and her stepfather was a collaborator of sorts. And the novel looks at how she doesn't fit in London, how she's far more attracted to London in ruins than she is to anything of London that's the social proprieties or standards of her father and his new wife's lives. I get impatient sometimes with some of Macaulay's landscape or nature description, but I enjoyed this all the same. It's a little bit too on the nose in some of the character names, and a little, what's the right word for it? Just a little too on the nose in a few places. But it's got all of Macaulay's very subtle critique of gender norms, all of her zingers, all of the sentences that turn from being a very kind of conventional sentence to a little poisonous barb at the end of the sentence. All of the things I really enjoy in Macaulay. So I would recommend The World My Wilderness if you enjoy mid-century novelists writing. If you enjoy Barbara Pym, you might enjoy Macaulay if you have some patience for the nature writing. And then the last thing I finished up this past week was Kate Atkinson's first novel, Behind the Scenes at the Museum. So this is published in the early 90s, and I thought this was fabulous. So it was my first time reading this. It's the story of Ruby, who is the first person narrator in the book, and the story starts from her perspective at the moment of conception. So that kind of rhetorical strategy is very similar to, say, Tristram Shandy. The novel traces Ruby's life from the moment of conception to about her 40s or 50s, just after her mother dies. So that kind of narrative arc that we all have, from our conception within our mothers to dealing with our mother's deaths. And Atkinson kind of does a great job of moving through Ruby's perspective and how it changes, and how her understanding of what's going on around her and her large, complex family changes as she ages, and some of the struggles she has to actually understand what's going on in her life. And she intercuts this first-person narrative with chapters that she calls footnotes, which shift to an omniscient third-person narrator and fill in all of the gaps, well, not all of the gaps, but many of the gaps, all of the things Ruby and her mother and grandmother and brothers, sisters, aunts, and uncles don't know about each other. So all of the missing stories are filled in these footnotes, which are long chapters, really, or medium-sized chapters. And it's great to see how Atkinson moves kind of so gracefully between these 2 points of view, and how this kind of device gives you a sense of both the complexity of these lives and of all human lives, and how much of the stories are lost just because that's the way human beings are. We lose a large part of each other's lives just because we don't know and can't know. So I would highly recommend Behind the Scenes at the Museum. I think it was a fabulous book. I think that almost brings me up to having read all of Atkinson's books. I think I have one left, Human Croquet, which I haven't read. Highly recommend Behind the Scenes at the Museum. So pretty good reading week for me. 2 duds, a couple of books that are okay, and a couple that I would recommend fairly highly. Hot Comb, The World My Wilderness, and Behind the Scenes at the Museum. I hope you've had a great week, and I'll see you later. Bye-bye.